I think the field trip was an excellent introduction to the talk today, because when I was up there, I was thinking about the tundra the entire time. So you have this mostly treeless landscape with many of the same plants and the same kind of trait space, I would say, that we see in the tundra ecosystem. So the reason why there are few trees we heard about on our trip was in Dartmoor up there was because of human influence and grazing. And in the tundra, it's because it's cold. There's human influence in grazing as well. So I'm going to be presenting a talk which is definitely a team talk that adds a bit of pressure here. So you've heard part of this story already. Hayden Thomas presented it. Was that yesterday? It seems like so long ago. And then the other key author who's I'm presenting on behalf of is Anne Bjorkman here, who's in the back of the room. So I hope I do justice to them. And then, like with Hayden's talk, there are many other authors, many of whom are in this room. So yeah, I hope I can pull it off and make you guys proud. So I'm going to be talking today about biome-scale patterns in tundra plant traits and warming-induced change over time. And this is a big collaborative effort. I might also make a shout out to the S-Tundra group, which was a group of us funded by the IDIV Center who got together and started this work almost 4 years ago, or possibly even 5 years ago now. And I want to start us back with the theme of the session today, which is the fundamental limits of trait space. So I thought, where is the environmental limit of trait space? And I want you to sort of change your perspective on the world. Instead of thinking of the world with the equator in the middle, think of the world from the top down, the North Pole in the center, which is where it should be. This is how I think of the world. So you can put North America at the top or the bottom. I don't mind about that, but North Pole in the middle. And so what's going on with trait space at this environmental extreme? And yeah, which biome is at the edge of trait space? It's got to be the tundra biome. So there's your nice edge of a permafrost thaw feature there to set yourself on and think about across this talk. So there it is, the beautiful tundra biome with an amazing international tundra experiment in the foreground here. These are open-top chambers warming up that tundra ecosystem. And we can see how that community is changing, and in a year or two, we'll be able to see how the traits are changing as well. So Anne's starting up a new protocol. If anyone works in open-top chamber systems, go talk to Anne at the back. And we can explore some of those patterns today in this talk as well. So for those of you who aren't tundra people, hopefully you have an inkling about this, but things are warming up at the top of the planet, and it's warming a lot faster than the rest of the planet. So we've already seen, depending on where you're at, possibly about 2 degrees of warming already. So we talk about the Paris Climate Agreement and being worried about this 2 degrees of warming over the next 100 years for the planet as a whole. The Arctic's already experiencing that level of warming, and some of the more extreme projections suggest there could be up to 10 degrees of warming over the next 100 years in these systems. And these are systems that switch between being frozen to being thawed each year. So that amount of warming can have a really big influence on the growing season when these plants are trying to make the most out of that short period of time where they're not frozen. So a lot of change could be going on up north. And a lot of change has happened already, and the plant communities are responding. So this is just to visualize it for you. It's the end of the day. We might be getting a bit tired, so I tried to put lots of pictures in this talk. There's some graphs too, so hopefully I got the right balance. So this is a field site that we work at in my research group, and it's Kikiktarik Herschel Island in the western Canadian Arctic, right on the border with Alaska on the Arctic coast there. And this is a picture taken in 1987 of a river creek there, so sort of visualize that landscape and look, you can see there's some ranunculus and there's buttercups, and then there are some subtle shrubs in the background. And if you go back to last year at that same site, the shrubs have taken over and dominated. It's not like this everywhere in this landscape, but there are places where there's been a really dramatic change. Keep in mind, these are perennial species. This is a very slow growing environment, and to see that much change in a couple of decades is pretty impressive. And that kind of change, there seems to be evidence for it around the circumpolar Arctic. So this is a literature review that I first published with many co-authors in 2011, and I've been updating it over the past few years. And so if you combine evidence from all sorts of different studies, so whether that's ecological monitoring over time, historical ecology, phenology records, dendroecology experiments, you see evidence of vegetation change, and in particular, indicated here, increases in shrubs across a lot of sites within the Arctic. Some places the change is there's more stability, and in a few places things are decreasing in terms of the shrubs, often because those systems are transitioning from being terrestrial to very wet ecosystems. And so why does all that vegetation change matter? So again, if you're not a tundra person, you might not realize, but these high latitude systems contain a huge amount of carbon. So what do we have here? 50% of below ground organic carbon is in high latitude systems, so the tundra and the boreal. So there's a lot of carbon stored up there, and it's also stored in these frozen soils that are very vulnerable to thaw. So there was a recent Nature paper that came out indicating that those high latitude systems are where we might see the greatest carbon losses over the next, say, 100 years or more. So the tundra matters, it's warming, and we're all here to talk about traits. And so traits, and we've heard this before this week, it's the traits themselves, not species identities, that really matter when you're trying to link particularly vegetation change to function change across the globe, and in particular in these tundra ecosystems. So we got excited in our group. I consider myself a global change ecologist. I'm not necessarily a trait ecologist. I feel like a bit of a traitor saying that here in this room, but I'm excited about how traits can come into this global change ecology perspective and give us a better understanding of what changes we might expect to see as systems like the tundra warm. So when we started this project, this was what the tri-map of records looked like, and we thought, this is great. We could put the traits into the vegetation change story we've been building over the past few years. But then we sort of noticed that if you cut it to the part of the world that we're most interested in, there were not so many records. And so you heard a bit about this the other day, but basically the tundra community are an incredibly generous community. So we sort of canvassed all of our colleagues and said, does anyone have trait data on your computers? Maybe you intended to make it publicly available, but you never got around to doing it. Just send it our way, we'll clean it up, and we'll put it to good use. And many, many people responded, and so we were overwhelmed with data we needed to clean, lots of cleaning. But we did manage to put together this database that Hayden presented to you before, and filled in, not everywhere, but a good chunk of that top part of the world, so we can start to ask these tundra biome questions with a fair bit of data to work with. And so Hayden gave you these stats as well in his talk, but we, for the presentation today, are focusing on sort of the 6 plant traits that are most commonly measured in these systems, that also happen to be ones that are part of that galactic plane study that we started the day off with, Sandra Diaz's talk, and are really important for linking community change to function change in these systems. And so 50,000 or so trait observations, and that really great coverage that we have in the tundra biome of many of the vascular plant species for which we have compositional data for. So the tundra biome as a whole has arguably around 2,000 species, so you might say, oh, that's a very species-poor ecosystem. All of you who work in the tropics might be scoffing at me right now, but one point we like to make is actually on a local scale, on the plot scale, the tundra biome is actually quite species-rich, so you can get a lot of the species, even if it's a very small, large species pool for the biome, in your meter-squared plot where the vegetation change and the function change is occurring. So it's a great place if you don't work in the tundra biome, but you want to do really cool trait ecology. Come up north, come to the dark side of the world in the wintertime, the bright side of the world in the summertime, and get stuck in, because there's things you can do by combining these kind of data sets that I don't think are possible in other biomes of the world at the moment. So for the talk today, I'm going to present a few, I've called them big questions. That was me trying to, maybe they're small questions, but we'll leave it there. So I'm going to start by talking to you about, just to revise Hayden's talk and remind you about whether tundra traits play by the global trait rules. Then I'm going to go briefly into talking a little bit about how well tundra traits do at explaining plant functional groups. So the commonly measured traits, do they help explain these plant functional groups that we often use to constrain our global change analyses? Then I'll briefly talk about how tundra plant traits vary across climate gradients, which is this biogeographic study we've been working on, and then I'll link that into how traits are changing over time. And I'll finish off with making that link from traits to functions. So I hope I can give you sort of a nice story of our trait work. Because I'm going to try and cover a bunch of these questions, I won't go into great detail, so come talk to me, Anne, or Hayden afterwards to get the detail you might require. So we'll start with the revision of Hayden's talk, Do Tundra Traits Play by the Rules? So I'm going to just throw up the graph that he presented to you. So just as a reminder, the gray dots there, that's the global trait space from the Diaz et al. Paper pretty much. And the blue dots are the tundra biome plotted on top of that. And to revise again, I didn't put Theresa May up here, but tundra trait data occupy about half of the sort of size axis and pretty much all of the economic axis there. And one point just to make, because it sort of came up in the questions after Hayden's talk, is about sort of how the sort of climatic variation within the tundra biome might relate to that trait space. And I'll pull that up in a second, but I forgot. In my talk, I've posted some unknowns. So these are, I've gone strategically for the unknowns that maybe we're going to touch on in this talk today, but they do come out of the breakout groups yesterday, either the one I was in or the one that Anne was in. She jotted some unknowns down for me. So I'm hoping that through some of this tundra work, we're starting to get at some of those unknowns that we as a community have identified. So that's unknown number one, as I phrased it: how do climatic extremes restrict species in global trait space? And so that's the tundra biome PCA now. And what we've done is we colored the dots by the sort of climate niche of each of those species. And so if there was really strong climatic gradients within that species level PCA there, you would see like the blue ones being all on one side and the red, the warmer sites, being all on the other side. But we don't actually see that much climate structuring at that species level. So maybe it's happening in other ways. That's again with all 6 traits. So maybe it's happening for some traits and not other traits. Let's see. Cool, so to sort of summarize question 1, do tundra traits play by the rules? I would say yes. Global trait relationships persist in the tundra. That 2-dimensional tundra trait space is consistent with the global trait space, but it's constrained along that morphological size axis. Most of the trait variation at that scale is among the species, but within species, variation matters at small scale. So that was sort of Hayden's talk the other day. And so now I'll move on to functional groups. So in a lot of the tundra work, and this is true globally, but maybe it's not true anywhere. Oh, now I've got my, it's no more true. That's what I want to say. Anywhere else than in the tundra, we tend to simplify things down to plant functional types to understand how global change is progressing in these systems. Because it's easier, because sometimes we don't have species level IDs, there's a variety of reasons, but often it comes down to loosely these 4 groups here. So the evergreen shrubs, the deciduous shrubs, the graminoids, and the forbs. And those are often the plant functional types that are found in the various Earth system models, et cetera. And so we were quite curious to know, and I think this is another potential one of those unknowns, how well do those common functional groups that are used within the literature map onto the traits that we measure? And are we doing a good job of characterizing those functional traits that link to the plant functional types? And so Hayden put in a huge amount of effort doing a lovely literature review of different studies in the tundra biome that have used plant functional types to summarize vegetation change responses. So the responses are on the x-axis there, the number of studies on the y, and then whether they found a significant difference between functional groups within their studies. And so there's a big mix there. So some studies do find differences, other studies don't, and a lot of studies find sort of unclear or inconsistent responses amongst functional groups. So we started to get to wonder about whether that functional group really relates to the traits that are out there. And so if you plot the distributions of the traits for a variety, so there are the 6 traits, based on those 4 functional groups, what you see is a lot of overlap. So that's what started to get us a bit concerned. And if you plot them as a PCA, then again, you see a lot of overlap. So groups are statistically different, but those groups only explain about 20% of the trait variation. So maybe depending on your application, that's enough. That gives you something to go with. But in other cases, maybe that's just a little bit too low. And so then we want to know which traits, the morphological or the economic traits, best explained that variation. And it was the economic traits in this case. So whether you're tall or short, within the tundra biome at least, doesn't seem to map on terribly clearly to your functional group. And that makes sense when you are out there. So you have tall grasses, you have tall shrubs, and you have short grasses and short shrubs and short forbs and so on. So those structural traits don't necessarily map onto the functional groups that we're using. So to summarize that, I mean, I should say there's a lot of traits we're not measuring in these large databases that may be the things that are best explaining those functional groups. But it's something to be cautious about, I think, particularly when we're using those very commonly measured traits that we have good spatial coverage for, that perhaps these functional groups don't match very well with the traits that we measure. So perhaps we need to know the limitations of the functional group approach and choose the right groups for our applications, and potentially consider sort of trait-based alternatives rather than using the functional groups themselves to classify our analyses. So next up, I'm going to talk more about this biogeographic part of our work and getting at the sort of patterns across climate space. So how do tundra plant traits vary across climate gradients? So I talked about at the beginning of the talk how the tundra is warming, and so there's a sort of map of where the warming is happening, and there's more warming at certain sites versus other sites, but most sites are really experiencing relatively dramatic warming. And I already introduced the trait data to you, but I haven't fully introduced the composition data. So these are the sites around the tundra biome where we have long-term ecological monitoring records, so about 27 years across the full data set, though it varies site by site, the duration. And within each of these macro sites, we have subsites representing different plant communities and then plots within that, which gives us a chance to explore how trait variation might be occurring at the community level. So I mentioned how the tundra vegetation change is occurring, and so I just wanted to give you a little bit more information, again, focused on the shrubs. So we have two previous studies, data syntheses of that network of plots, where we found that the probability of increasing tall shrub abundance is higher at sites that are experiencing more summer temperature change on the left there, and that if you use those open-top chamber experiments, throw them down on the tundra, you see a variety of the different plant functional groups, including the shrubs, responding positively to that warming or that protection from wind or other factors that you get when you use these open-top chambers. So taken together, this kind of work suggests to us when we warm these tundra ecosystems up, some plant species do indeed respond. And I think this is a nice pairing of talks because I don't have to say much about hierarchical Bayesian approaches because we've just heard about it. So thanks, Mike. But what we've done in this analysis is we've used a fully hierarchical Bayesian approach so that all of the trait data, all of the plot composition data, the individual records go into the analysis, and then we can make estimates as we move up the different scales all the way to some sort of biome level estimate. So we preserve and maintain that variation. And this was another thing that came up as an unknown in some of the, or an unknown or a priority, however you look at it. Trying to get at how variation propagates as you move from individuals, populations, species, communities up to the biome. And if you want to know more about the specifics of the analysis, come talk to us afterwards. So just to remind you, so we want to know how do individual and community level plant traits vary across climate gradients. So there's the climate gradient in the tundra biome. And here are some results. So we're starting with height here. So this is a plot of the within species variation in plant height. So each of the gray lines in this plot is an individual species in the data set. And the blue line is the overall mean across all the species. And we're moving across a gradient on the x-axis there of summer temperatures in these sites, and then height on the y-axis. So with height, we see within species relationships between summer temperatures and height, and then together. But if we take a different trait, so in this case, specific leaf area, we see sort of it looks like pickup sticks to me. So individual species have different within species relationships with this climate variable, and so we don't pick that up within the species. So strong temperature trait relationships for traits related to size, but no consistent relationship for many more of the economic traits. So now if we look at this on a community level, so doing a community-weighted mean, or if you will, a community-weighted distribution, because it's a Bayesian analysis. So we've got basically the same axis on the x-axis there, summer temperatures, but now we have the community height, so weighted by the abundance of the species within the plots. And we've broken it down by two moisture classes here. So the darker color is sites that are wetter, and the lighter color is sites that are drier. And again, this blue here is height, so we see a positive relationship for both wet and dry sites at that community level. But if we throw SLA back on there, we start to see some differences with soil moisture. So the dry sites show no relationship, and the wet sites show a strong relationship. And if you remember back, the within species variation was all over the place for SLA, but the community level variation is a very strong relationship here, at least for the wetter sites. So to summarize there, strong temperature-trait relationships over space, but the strength of the relationship depends on soil moisture and depends on trait. Great, so this was also, I felt one of the unknowns that came up at points in the discussion. Are there interactions between trait-climate relationships and the different climate variables that we might be looking at? So for example, temperature and moisture, and at least in the tundra biome, we think we found evidence of this. So even though the tundra biome is a very cold place and it's sort of restricted very much by temperature, it also covers a huge variation in soil moisture. So there are parts of the tundra biome that are classified as polar deserts. They have very little precipitation and they're incredibly dry environments down to incredibly wet aquatic environments. And so we may be seeing different vegetation change responses in those different environmental settings. So to summarize that section, how do tundra plant traits vary across climate gradients? We found strong climate trait relationships. We found those relationships with temperature, and there seems to be an interaction with moisture in the site. Height has both within and community level relationships, but for example, SLA has only among community relationships. And we looked at these for various other traits, but I haven't presented them in the talk today. But if you want to know more, come chat to us afterwards. So now I'll move on to the question of, are tundra traits changing over time and with warming? So now we've done that biogeographic analysis, we have a spatial understanding of these trait-climate relationships, and we might use those to make predictions of how things should be changing over time. And so there, again, is the spatial temperature-trait relationship. On the top is height, on the bottom is SLA. So you've got, at the community level, those strong positive relationships. And so we can have an expectation for how things should change over time if those spatial relationships are carried out across time, across the period of monitoring. And we can use the actual vegetation change and the community-weighted means or distributions of that vegetation change to test those expectations. So we expect large community changes in community traits with warming, and that's based on that spatial temperature-trait relationship and the mean warming trend experienced at each site. And this is what we have observed. So I got some nods, that's good. So for height, we see very much in line with our expectations, things are increasing. But for SLA, we pick up no change, unlike our expectation. So there you go. And so maybe there's some sort of lag effect going on here, and maybe we can unpack this a bit more in the following slides. And so what we think might be going on here is the sort of mechanism of change. So we've got sort of a square diagram here, and I'm going to pull up a few different mechanisms that could be causing traits to change at the community level in these systems. So the first is shifts in the abundance of resident species, and we know that's going on at these sites because we've tested for it and it's there, and we think it's related to warming. But we could also have phenotypic plasticity going on, and one of the other unknowns that I didn't put on the slide is we don't have very much, and this was discussed in my breakout group, data of traits on individuals measured across time. So whether that's across the growing season to understand variability within the growing season, or across multiple years or decades to really understand plasticity. So often we are working with data sets where the plasticity part is very much unknown. We could also have immigration of new species coming into these plant communities who bring with them new traits, which changes the community level trait distribution. And we could have evolution going on. And some of these mechanisms are faster. They can occur at relatively rapid rates, particularly in these slow-growing tundra biomes. And other of these mechanisms are just going to play out much more slowly. So immigration of new species might occur quickly if that local species pool has those species in it and they just need to invade the plots. But in these tundra systems, species from farther south are often very far away, and it's going to be a very long time before they can reach these environments. Oh, I did put it on there. So there you go. So how important are plasticity, abundance, change, turnover, and evolution as drivers of trait change is something that came up in the discussion group I was in as well. So just to sort of unpack that a little bit for plant height here, these are the graphs I've already showed you with an extra line added on there, so that dotted line that the red arrow points to. One of the things we thought could be really cool to do in our hierarchical Bayesian analysis is we can actually incorporate the within species trait-climate relationship to sort of estimate how much plasticity these communities might experience over the period of monitoring that we have. And so we can do that for each of the traits and see what that changes about how we might have observed the trait change that's going on. So you can see in the case of height, we have these strong within species trait relationships, and if we apply that to our model of trait change over time, that makes it a stronger relationship. So, and I think sort of incorporating that within species into the community level trait change is maybe something that is a good approach to take. And there are a variety of ways to do that, which was also discussed in our working group, and this is one approach. But that only gets us so far, because that's the trait variation that's been that has occurred under the current conditions that those plants are experiencing. And really what we want to know in global change ecology is what's going on sort of beyond the current limits, so in those sort of non-analog climates. And so the only ways to get at this are experiments. And so what we are working on as a group at the moment is sort of combining warming experiments, Covent Garden experiments, and the databases that we've compiled to try and get at this idea of getting real estimates of trait plasticity in these non-analog warmer climates. And we also think we should be measuring trait data over time. So we'll be working on that over the next, maybe in a decade or so, we can get back to you on that one. And so that gets at another unknown that came up in the discussions. What are the limits to trait plasticity in non-analog climates? Great, so to summarize that section of the talk, are tundra traits changing over time and with warming? Height is, and the other traits are not yet. So despite these strong biogeographic gradients, so far, height's the only trait that's changing, and future trait change could be mediated by turnover, so new species coming into these communities, moisture, or evolution and other factors. And that mechanism of change will influence how rapidly that change will occur. And so finally, at this point in the talk, I just want to touch on how tundra traits link to functions. And this is some ongoing work in the lab that we're trying to pull together at the moment. And so, as this whole room knows, traits link nicely to various different functions. And so in this example, leaf traits such as specific leaf area and leaf nitrogen, which influence rates of photosynthesis and decomposition, can influence carbon uptake, storage, release, CO2, etc. So by having measurements of the traits, you can get some understanding of this whole carbon cycling process. And other traits, so maybe we haven't talked as much about this, and this is particularly a tundra high latitude function. Things like canopy height can create structure that traps snow in the system, and when those shrubs extend above the snowpack, they change the albedo, the surface reflectance of the system, and can bring a lot more heat into the system. So this is something that we're quite concerned about, whether there would be a strong positive feedback to regional warming as you change shrub vegetation, increase it within tundra ecosystems. And so knowing about the trait canopy height could be quite useful in that context. And so to try and link trait change to function change, we can start to integrate, again, these different data sets. So the vegetation data, the composition data that we have across those sites, the trait data that we have, and understand, therefore, community trait change, and then link that again to decomposition of the specific species for which we have composition data for. And this is, how many are familiar with the meeting of litters experiment that Hans Cornelissen, a few people in the room? It's a great experiment, check it out. So Hans very generously was like, here, have the data, I'm done with it. Handed them over to Hayden and I, and Hayden has done the experiment in the Yukon with a different suite of species, some overlapping species, so we can pool those European data with North American data and get an understanding of how decomposition varies across these different tundra species. And this gets at that unknown of how does trait change link to function change. And then I thought I'd throw in something about another experiment that Hayden's been working on, which I think links to traits as well. So this is the Tundra teabag experiment. It started off as a total side project, fun thing. I told you about how the tundra plant community, tundra ecologists are very generous with their time. So we said, hey, does anyone want to stick some teabags in the ground at their site, and then send them to us, and we'll do some decomposition work on that. And we thought, we get a handful of people saying, oh yeah, that'd be fun. But instead we got loads of people. So we ended up with 354 sites. That's 4,000 odd tea bags stuck in the ground across the tundra biome. And this is part of the global tea bag experiment where they've chosen very carefully 2 types of tea which represent 2 very different types of plant leaf traits. So we have our rooibos tea, which is more recalcitrant, and we have a green tea that is more labile. And so Hayden's actually looked to see how well those 2 tea types separate on the decomposability of tundra plant data. And so you can see they actually do a pretty good job. So rooibos is right at the recalcitrant end, and green tea is actually somewhere in the middle of the more labile end. And so I'll just throw you right into some results. The 2 tea types do have very different distributions of decomposition and mass loss. And they have pretty strong environmental relationships. So we get, and they're very linear, which surprised us. So as you go from colder to warmer sites, you get more mass loss. And as you go from wetter to drier sites, drier to wetter sites, I should say, again, more mass loss at those wet sites. Even sites that are fully saturated soils seem to decompose a lot when you use this tea substrate. And then what we've also been working on is basically calculating the community-weighted decomposability of these plant communities over time. So that's linking the vegetation change to the traits to the decomposition experiment. And we see more decomposable plant communities at warmer sites versus colder sites. And we did do the preliminary analysis of the change over time. So again, using those composition data. In this case, we find a lot of different distributions centered over 0. So even sites that are experiencing strong warming are not experiencing a change in that community level decomposition. So what's going on there? You're probably tired, you just want to get to the beers. I'll try and get you there soon. But if you think back to some of the trait work that I was just presenting to you before, the traits that link to decomposition are not the ones that are changing strongly over time at the moment. So we're probably seeing lags and maybe some compensation for certain traits offsetting. So we have maybe more woody plant material in these systems, but we also have more labile plant material at the same time. So that's ongoing work. And again, it basically comes down to the amount of change a plant community experiences depends on the mechanism of change. And that could be through, in this case, decomposition through those climate parameters, temperatures and soil moisture influencing decomposition change directly, or perhaps vegetation change through traits is actually a more important influence on the amount of decomposition change that a community will experience. So to summarize there, decomposability hasn't changed yet much over time. Traits do correlate with litter decomposition. Warmer communities have more decomposable traits, but that change over time hasn't occurred yet. So those were the 5 questions. And just to briefly summarize here, I just wanted to put it back in that global context. So do tundra plant traits play by the rules? Yes. What about functional groups? How well do they explain traits, or how well do traits explain the functional groups? Not so well for the tundra biome, but it was the economic traits. So you can see I've gone yellow economic on this side that did a better job. How do traits vary across climate gradients? Strongly. How are traits changing over time? It's the more structural traits that are the ones that are changing over time at the moment, and it's variable depending on trait. And how do traits link to function? They link strongly, but that change over time has not been observed in our analyses so far. And that is that variation along that global trait axis. So I'll end on pretty pictures. What is the road ahead for tundra trait ecology and maybe trait ecology in different biomes? I think more experimentation, pushing things beyond the limits is key. There's our common garden experiment in the Yukon. Getting below ground, so I didn't really touch on this because though we have below ground data, we need to do a better job in the tundra of really getting the spatial representation there. So that's a shrub, that was the above ground biomass, and that is the extent of the below ground coarse woody roots. So it's all happening below ground in the tundra for sure. Maybe we can use drones to measure traits. If anyone wants to chat drones with me afterwards, this is work that we're doing in the lab as well. That's Shrubcopter the drone. And you can get really cool things off of these drones that weren't possible up until very recently. So structural models of individual plants to spectral understanding of how things change across the growing season. And those were the knowledge gaps if you want to revise them in your spare time. And I'll end there. So I hope you enjoyed that talk. So I hope you're sitting on the edge of the limits of trait space across this session here. ready for your beer to rehydrate. Thanks, and any questions?